Welcome, everybody. My name is Julia Griffith. I'm the program coordinator here at Historic Milwaukee. We are currently being recorded, so if you have to duck out a little early or anything like that, well, this will be available to share. I'll send it out to everyone who registered. We are very excited to have with us tonight local historian Ben Hubing, who is both an educator and an educational consultant and has studied at pretty much, his checklist of Wisconsin universities is getting filled up. But in particular, he has a master's in history from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, which explores the intersections of civil rights, politics, and constitutional history. And it's from these studies that we are going to talk about his newly published book, George Wallace in Wisconsin, the Divisive campaign that shaped a civil rights legacy. So I won't say too much more other than that. If you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat. Ben and I will chat a little bit more at the end. And otherwise, I will let him take it away.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Julie. I really appreciate the opportunity of being here tonight with Historic Milwaukee. I'm a big fan of all the work that you all do locally to tell the history of our great city. So it's an honor to be here tonight. And to those of you that are here, thanks so much for taking some time out of a lovely evening here to talk a little bit about some local history here that was part of my book. So the title of my book is pretty self-explanatory. It's George Wallace in Wisconsin, right? So it's looking at Governor George Wallace from the state of Alabama and his many trips up to the Badger States. So I kind of first became interested in this topic while I was a grad student at UWM a couple of years back. I was reading a book for a class I was taking on African Americans in the Central Cities, I think was the name of the course. And right in the middle of one of the books I was reading, it mentioned George Wallace, right? And I had some knowledge of him as a history teacher. And it talked about his, coming up to Wisconsin and just essentially packing a crowded room at Serb Hall, which for those of you that know the city, it's, on the south side, and just kind of filling up a packed crowd of really boisterous supporters. And it really got me thinking, that's surprising, right? Wallace was known as kind of a foil in the civil rights movement, kind of like the visible opponent of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. And I knew he ran for president, but I didn't really think about how his support might exist outside of the Deep South. So that portion of that book really got me thinking, who in Wisconsin would back George Wallace? Why would they like George Wallace? What types of people would find his campaign and his ideals appealing up here? It was really surprising to me, knowing what I knew about the Badger State and its progressive tradition, that he'd have like such a strong support. So that really was where the interest of what became my book kind of started. And from there, I really dug in first with his campaign in 1964, and then from there, and really just was fascinated by how this guy traveled around the Badger States. And in many ways, just a circus ensued, right? He attracted lots of media attention, lots of really loud supporters, but also really vocal dissent and protest as well. So I thought it was a really interesting story. And I was really pleased when my work at UWM was turned into a book, and I'm happy that all of you are interested enough to come tonight and learn a little bit more about it. So thought I would just kind of give a brief overview of Wallace's campaigns in Wisconsin, talk a little bit about who his message resonated with, who it didn't resonate with, and then maybe talk a little bit about some parallels to today, and then I'm open to any questions that you all have. So without further ado, let's chat a little bit, right, about George Wallace. Just a little context, right? George Wallace and the civil rights movement in Wisconsin, most notably Milwaukee, really kind of hit the crescendo and begin to recede kind of around the same time. Like we're talking, the time period is around the early 1960s. The civil rights movement around the country is really starting to pick up momentum with national leaders like Martin Luther King and others, of course. But this is also the same time that our own state's civil rights history is really beginning to take off as well. So thought it was interesting to see this kind of collision course that these two groups of people were on, right? Wallace gets his fame as being elected the governor of Alabama in the late 1950s. And in his inaugural address, he promises segregation forever, segregation now, today, and forever, right? He's a big big supporter of segregation, right? And his time as governor of Alabama, he makes it very clear that he is going to oppose any civil rights locally or nationally that would change that. Most famously, Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door. The University of Alabama was required to integrate to comply with federal law, and Wallace stood in the door and prevented 2 African-American students from enrolling in the early 1960s, 1962, 1963. And ultimately, the Kennedy administration brings in the guard, and eventually Wallace is kind of forced to back down. But this is standing in the schoolhouse door really propels Wallace to being kind of a little-known guy nationally, to becoming like a guy that is kind of the national face of segregation and of opposition to civil rights. The bombing of the Birmingham church, in which 4 young people were killed, and the marches on Selma will only continue to kind of build Wallace's profile as this kind of visible, vocal opponent of civil rights. Again, it's maybe surprising that a guy like that would find a home in Wisconsin politically, so to speak, but we'll get to that, right? At the same time that Wallace is sort of rising to prominence nationally, Wisconsin's own civil rights movement is really beginning to take shape. Really the kind of the unofficial beginning of civil rights movement in Wisconsin is the murder of an unarmed Black man named Bell. His last name was Bell, in the late 1950s. And from there, the Black community in Milwaukee in particular really started to gain more urgency and more of a desire to start pushing for more civil rights. So Milwaukee eventually becomes known as the Selma of the North, led by leaders like Vel Phillips, Father Grappi, and countless others that were really key to kind of beginning this civil rights movement right here in our home state here in Wisconsin. Initially, it's really some of the big goals that the civil rights movement is pushing here locally include integrating schools. Although it was the 1960s and Brown v. Board had been decided about 10 years earlier, most schools, including MPS, had not really fully and authentically integrated. So civil rights groups like the Milwaukee Division of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Milwaukee chapter of the NAACP, they're really starting to start to push for authentic and meaningful integration of schools. At the same time, we start to see housing, fair housing, open access to housing in Milwaukee becomes a major issue that many African-American and civil rights supporters begin to push for. So as Wallace is starting to begin his first campaign in 1964, these two sort of forces converge, right? Wallace really begins to hit prominence in this time and decides to launch his first campaign at the same moment that the Milwaukee and the Wisconsin civil rights movements and those local chapters are really starting to pick up momentum. And it's kind of a perfect storm for what will happen next, which is Wallace surprises everybody and declares that he will run in the Democratic primary in the 1964 presidential election. Okay. For any history nerds out there, Lyndon Johnson had just taken over after the death of JFK. And so he was the presumptive nominee in 1964. And no surprise, he chooses to run. But Wallace decides to challenge the sitting president in his own party primary, which is pretty rare, right? We don't see that a whole lot. Usually if you are the sitting president and you have a good deal of popularity, you don't have people trying to run against you, right? But Wallace and Johnson are very different. They're both Democrats and they both run in the Democratic primary. But it's also worth pointing out that the parties themselves are very different than they are today, right? There could be conservative Democrats like Wallace. There were liberal Republicans. So the party structures and who would be in the parties today are very different than they were in the early 1960s. And as a conservative, states' rights, pro-segregationist Democrat, Wallace decides to challenge the more liberal Texan LBJ in the primaries. Primaries were kind of weird in the early 1960s. Not all states had like primary elections in the way that we have them today. And by the time Wallace entered, there were only 3 primaries that were essentially left: Wisconsin, Indiana, and Maryland. And he enters those 3, 2 of the 3 obviously in some Midwestern states. And Wallace kind of goes up and campaigns in Wisconsin off and on for several weeks. His big message in this election was kind of interesting, right? He is an avowed segregationist, right? And it's not clear that message, at least that overt message, would play super well in Wisconsin. So instead of kind of overtly opposing civil rights and promoting racist ideas, he kind of just vaguely comes out against the Civil Rights Act, right? He believes that this is a states' rights issue, right? He says, if Wisconsin wants to have Civil rights, if they want to integrate, that's great. That's up to Wisconsin. They can choose to do it. And if they don't, that's up to Wisconsin too, right? It should be a states' rights approach, right? So his opposition to the civil rights bill, at least when he was running for president, is not one of overt racism, at least not like blatantly out there that way. But instead, it's more of an opposition like, hey, states' rights, right? This national government is becoming too powerful. If this bill passes, it could really get rid of like sovereignty for local school boards and local village boards and even the state of Wisconsin. So he kind of campaigns on this idea of like states' rights rather than kind of like at least overtly on the issue of race, okay? What's interesting, though, is Wallace has a track record that precedes him, right? He is an avowed segregationist, and his policies obviously were, it had a negative impact on people of color in Alabama. And so when he decides, even with this kind of more muted approach, he obviously attracts all kinds of attention from all kinds of folks that support civil rights and support people of color. So Wallace, we'll talk more about like who comes out for him and who comes out against him later. But he attracts all kinds of attention. He goes to college campuses and gets all kinds of attention at, like, it was Oshkosh State, now UW Oshkosh, and Whitewater State, and then UW Whitewater. He comes to Marquette University. And wherever he goes, he attracts a great deal of attention. There's supporters there, but there's also opponents, white and black, people that did not support Wallace, that thought his views were dangerous, that they'd hurt the state and the country if he were to get the party's nomination. And it basically just turns into like a media circus. Wherever he goes, the media is there. There's like vocal opposition there, supporters there, and it just becomes this kind of free for all, which becomes really, really interesting. Now, ultimately, Wallace does not win the state of Wisconsin. He wins, however, about a quarter of the vote in the party primary, and approaching, and that's the total vote, including Republicans. The two primaries are obviously separate. He wins about a third of the Democratic vote to about 66% of his opponents. So Wallace doesn't win. He claims he won without winning, but he does surprisingly well, right? A quarter of the state and about a third of the Democrats in the state that voted in the party primary cast their ballot for George Wallace, like an avowed segregationist and someone who, pretty vocally has been an opponent of civil rights. That's surprising, right? And a lot of people wonder, what it was about his candidacy that made that happen. We'll talk a little bit about some of those ideas later. So 4 years later, Wallace decides to run again, a second time for president. This time he skips the primaries and decides to go straight to the general election, and he runs as an independent candidate, his American Party or whatever. And he runs as an independent, an American independent, and just straight up challenges the two candidates running for the Democratic and Republican seats. Nixon in '68 is running for election, and Humphrey, the Democrat, and Johnson's VP are running kind of head to head in this really hotly contested and really important election during the Vietnam War. When Wallace runs this time, the Civil Rights Bill is passed, right? The national law is passed since 1964. And so his new kind of talking points where he can kind of talk about, states' rights and issues without kind of overtly talking about race, was law and order. Now that might ring familiar to people that follow news over the last 4 or 5 years, but law and order for him is to restore, what he sees as chaos in the country. He talks about Vietnam War protesters. He talks about civil rights protesters. He talks about, this is a time period where there's lots of urban unrest, and cities like Watts and Newark and Milwaukee and Detroit have uprisings of various sorts, right? So the law and order maybe is race neutral if you just think about it like that, but however, to certain people, it meant certain things, right? So law and order to many of his supporters and to many of his opponents had kind of a coded message that many people took note of, right? But again, this election, he comes to Wisconsin only two times this time. He's running, in a national election, not in a primary this time. He comes to Milwaukee and then to Oshkosh and then to Racine on his second trip. And again, really vocal opposition. By this time, the Milwaukee civil rights movement has really hit its peak. You have the youth council that's now formed. You have the commandos through the NAACP, which are promoting a not non-violent approach, which means that they will defend themselves if need be. And again, all these folks converge in these different places and spaces during Wallace's short campaign in 1968 in Wisconsin. The Milwaukee Auditorium becomes a scene where Wallace supporters and opponents shout each other down, and there's protests and counter protests. Oshkosh turns into, I think, what his campaign manager called one of the nastiest group of opponents, opposition that Wallace had in the 68 campaign, which is interesting. And ultimately, Wallace, again, doesn't win. He doesn't really expect to win, I don't think, in 1968. He's taken on the two major parties, and as a third party, he has some disadvantages there. But again, he wins in several southern states. He wins electoral votes. I believe he's one of the last major candidates to do that in 1968 since today. And he also wins about 8% of the vote in Wisconsin. Again, much less than 4 years earlier, but this is a national election. This is not a primary, and many, about 8% of the state to vote independent to vote for Wallace is still a pretty decent amount when you consider the disadvantages that third parties generally have. So 68 runs as independent, and again has a pretty decent showing in Wisconsin. By 1972, Wallace decides to run it for a third time for president, and again makes several stops in Wisconsin. He enters the primary in the Democratic Party this time, doesn't run as an independent again. And this is a really crowded Democratic primary. You have like McGovern, you have Shirley Chisholm, you have Humphrey again. You've got all these folks that are trying to run, and Wallace, again, as a conservative Democrat, faces a very crowded Democratic primary in 1972. By this time period, one of the major hot button issues of race in the country was federal busing policy, right? Busing was one way that the federal government attempted to achieve integration, right? If communities of color and white communities don't live amongst each other, one way to achieve integration was to, in some schools, was to bus students from Black communities to white communities and vice versa. And so federal busing policies in many northern cities became a really hot button issue. Not as much in Wisconsin at this point, but bigger cities like Boston and New York, these became really heated and contested issues of busing. And again, Wallace, again, is talking about issues of race, but again, without saying the quiet part out loud, so to speak, right? He's talking about busing, which is a hot button issue. And again, using the idea of states' rights, that states should make their own education policy. Local communities and local school boards should decide where their students go. The federal government should stay out of these things, right? So again, Wallace is using a kind of code of sorts to tap into these issues of racial animus in our country, and does well again in Wisconsin, wins about 22% of the votes in Wisconsin in a relatively crowded field. That's good enough for second place. The guy who wins, George McGovern, ultimately gets the nomination. But again, Wallace does surprisingly well in a state that he isn't really expected to do all that much. And in an election that he entered pretty belatedly. He entered the Wisconsin primary only with about 2 weeks to go, and again, does pretty well. Again, he fills up the Milwaukee Auditorium. He fills up Serb Hall. He goes to different campuses and travels around the state, from Appleton to Oshkosh to Sheboygan to Milwaukee to Madison, very briefly. But ultimately finds about a quarter of the Democratic primary, again, supports him in this campaign. Okay. After the Milwaukee success, Wisconsin success in the Wisconsin primary, he goes on to win the Michigan primary and the Maryland primary. So he's like legit winning northern states here at this point, or Maryland, maybe not north, but winning states outside the Deep South. But while he's in Maryland campaigning, he is shot by a Milwaukeean, a guy named Arthur Bremer. Bremer's was a Milwaukeean that lived only blocks away from Serb Hall, actually, had some mental health issues, and thought that a way that he could impress his girlfriend who had broken up with him was to shoot George Wallace, which I don't think it worked. But more importantly for Wallace, it left him disabled. He was wheelchair bound for the rest of his life after the bullets went through his spine. So although it didn't happen in Wisconsin, Bremer was a Milwaukeean that stalked Wallace from Wisconsin, worked on his campaign actually to Michigan and to Maryland, where he finally did shoot and disable Wallace. So the primary in Wisconsin, again, plays a pretty prominent role, and Wallace, again, does kind of better than expected, okay? By 1976, this is his final attempt at running for president, and by this point, Wallace's campaign is really muted, right? He is no longer the presumptive Southern Democrat. Jimmy Carter is running in 1976, and he's kind of in Wallace's lane in a lot of ways. He's an outsider. He's a Southerner. He's not as conservative as Wallace, but he wins like primaries in Southern states. So by the time the primary comes up to the north, Wallace is really like trailing and the campaign's kind of falling apart. His rhetoric also really tapers off quite a bit by 76. Like in 64, he was hardcore like states' rights, segregation, right? And so on. By 76, he's really tapered off his message. He's talking about like taxation being too high and bureaucracy out of control, like less government in that way. But he's really like cut off, his fiery rhetoric and his use of racial issues to kind of galvanize support has really waned by this point. He also does not really hold any rallies in this campaign, which is where all the interesting confrontations and issues that we'll talk about came up. His rhetoric is really more muted. His stances are more muted. He's also not able to move around as easily, being wheelchair bound. And he only wins about 12.5% of the vote. And by the time the Wisconsin primary has ended, Wallace is essentially like firing members of his staff. He rents out his airplane that he was using to travel around. And it's kind of the end of Wisconsin, kind of marks both the beginning of his hopes of becoming president in 1964 and also the end of any hopes he had by 1976. So it's kind of a bookend to Wallace's presidential aspirations. So those were the 4 times that Wallace ran for president. During those 4 times, Wallace had pretty consistent support and opposition from different groups, right? He brought out, again, in this like very circus-like atmosphere, he brought out folks from all walks of life, and they were forced to confront each other in these public spaces, right? Wallace packs Serb Hall, this really famous South Side gathering place that is kind of an important political place. Kennedy was there and others as well. Over time, it's like this kind of central place in Milwaukee where political leaders come for support. Packs the place full of loud and vocal supporters of his views. They sing Dixie in Polish, which I'd love to hear a rendition of. I couldn't find a recording of that. That'd be pretty cool. And Wallace famously says, like, if I ever leave Alabama, I'm moving to the south side of Milwaukee, which he never did. Here you can see him riding on a snowmobile with one of his supporters, a farmer out in Watertown. He has supporters at the airport, which are greeting him, and he really garners like large pockets of support. His support largely comes from white working class folks. A lot of his support in the city came from Southsiders in Milwaukee's ethnic neighborhoods. Poles and others that lived on the south side came out in big numbers. And for these folks, they had potentially a lot would change if civil rights laws and legislation went through, right? If we think about communities and how they would change, Wallace found a receptive audience of kind of white working class folks who were worried about what it would mean for civil rights laws and fair housing laws and so on to come through. He also does really well up in the Fox Valley and like Appleton and so on in that area up there, and finds pockets of support in rural areas as well. He really travels throughout the state. He's up in like Superior. He goes all the way down to like Racine, Kenosha, Madison for some of his trips. He really garners like large pockets of support in this state, which again is surprising. He is like an outsider that is really known for a controversial past, and he is someone that is not the most polished politician, right? He will, some people, his supporters often say he tells it like it is. He speaks truth to power, and that's what folks really liked about Wallace, right? Whether it was opposing the civil rights bill or providing law and order and restoring order to our unorderly cities, as Wallace said, whether it's opposing taxes or busing, Wallace found vocal support in lots of pockets of the state, to be sure. He also found lots of opposition, it's worth pointing out, right? Labor unions were worried about Wallace's like his right to work policies. Democratic Party leaders, the governor of the state, Governor Lucey, and before that Governor Reynolds, were big opponents of Wallace generally throughout his campaigns. African Americans came out in really large swaths and in large groups to oppose Wallace, right? We're going to see like this is really, again, the civil rights movement is really emerging, and Wallace is really coming onto the scene right as these groups are picking up momentum. And arguably Wallace's campaigns play a role in kind of helping these groups have he's a clear and vocal and obvious foil to the goals and gains that these groups want to make to have a more fair and just society. So for them, he's kind of a clear, villain. And so they come out in large numbers. The Black community really, especially in the 1964 and 1968 elections, have large protests. They hold counter demonstrations. They go to his events and picket them. And they vocally fight back in the press as well. So African-American communities inspired by the goals of civil rights and obviously opposing Wallace's segregationist past, come out in large numbers in Milwaukee and in Madison. And African Americans also find allies, although there aren't many African Americans living in some of these other cities like Sheboygan and Appleton and others. There are students, college students on these campuses, and also other white supporters throughout the state that come out on their behalf when Wallace leaves Milwaukee, where the predominantly and where predominantly most African Americans in the state lived at the time. So we see pretty sustained and consistent opposition to Wallace throughout, whether it be at his own rallies, whether it be their own counter protests, whether it be publishing articles. We also see the Black community really mobilizing and trying to get out the vote, right? Trying to support leaders that support their causes, as well as Black leaders like Vel Phillips and others. There's a lot of electioneering and like proactive measures. It's worth pointing out that this is at a time where there's tons of things on the agenda for a lot of these groups, like the Milwaukee chapter of the NAACP and the Milwaukee chapter of CORE. They're pushing for open housing laws. They're pushing for school integration. They're pushing for an end to racist hiring policies at businesses and companies in the state and the city of Milwaukee. So there's a lot of things on their plates. And so Wallace is not the only act in town, but he does really do a lot to galvanize opposition. And these groups do come out in large numbers to oppose him, especially in his first two campaigns. When these groups collide, it's really interesting. There's lots, it becomes a kind of a circus-like atmosphere. In 1964, Wallace has packed this like crowded South Side, building Serb Hall, and right in the middle of it, Black protesters sit and refuse to stand during the national anthem, like echoes of some of that controversy today. And a shouting match ensues between the tavern owner who has sponsored this event and the Black protesters who are in the building, and it becomes this really like highly charged racialized event. In 1968, we see the Black Commandos and the Youth Council packing, filling up this auditorium, Milwaukee Auditorium downtown, which was mostly Wallace supporters, but filling up a large contingency of some of these civil rights groups. And again, shouting matches, chants, counter demonstrations ensue between the two, which you can kind of see in the image there on the right. In the bottom left, that is the 1968 election in Oshkosh. And again, a lot of these cities, even cities that were not predominantly Black or didn't have a very large Black population, there were large pockets of supporters and opponents that came out and again clashed with each other, and like riot police were brought in. Wallace hid behind a bulletproof podium, that's the word I'm looking for, and like it was pretty intense. At one point, someone throws an apple core and it bounces off and hits Wallace, and he has to be cleaned off right in the middle of the speech. So these are really like charged and intense events that are happening, and the clashes between Wallace supporters and opponents are really, I think, really interesting. In 1976, Wallace, remember, was bound to his wheelchair. And a group of Madison protesters, and I think it was one of probably the most controversial kind of counter protests against Wallace, put on a mask of Arthur Bremer. You can see the image here on the bottom, in the center there, bottom, put on a mask of Arthur Bremer and pushed wheelchairs around that they had rented, kind of mocking Wallace and, saying, he should stand up and he's in the hot seat and so on. And that was probably one of the most controversial demonstrations of Wallace during his times in Wisconsin. This group was rebuked by the U.S. Senate, as a result of that kind of insensitive protest. So it's just to say that there was really like intense clashes between both the supporters and the opponents of Wallace, right? These are people that maybe wouldn't encounter each other much in everyday life, or maybe they would encounter each other, but their dividing lines were not known to them, right? And Wallace really divides the state on a lot of these issues. Although he doesn't directly use racialized language, some of his phrases, like I said, are code to many people and mean lots of very racialized things beneath the surface. Law and order, giving states the right to segregate. These are issues that many people felt very strongly about, and neighbors and community members came out and clashed, maybe publicly for the first time, over some of these issues. And it was Wallace and Wallace events that really brought these folks out. The media plays a really interesting role in this election. Wallace hates the media and ultimately doesn't use the phrase fake news. I don't think that's around yet. But he bashes the Milwaukee Journal. He's really critical of other newspapers. And he says that they're like really unfair, that they have cartoons that are mean and they're not giving him a fair shake. They're only covering the protesters and not his actual message. If they would just sit down and talk with him, he's a good guy and his message would resonate with them. So in many interesting ways, like this, this clash between the media and politicians, Wallace, I don't know if he's the first to do that, certainly not, I would guess, but it's, again, it echoes to today where there's accusations of media bias and all those sorts of things. The media was certainly covering these events. And one thing you could definitely say is that the media, generally the cartoons were more negative. Wallace was a racist outsider, and a lot of these newspapers did not hold back. They published like his comments and they fact checked them, right? One thing that you could say, though, is that Wallace gets tons of media attention, tons of free attention. When he shows up in a community, the press is there. He doesn't have to advertise a whole lot. He's on the news. He's in the papers. He gets all this free publicity. So although he might be right that the media is not on his team, certainly, he gets all kinds of free publicity from the media as well. It's also worth pointing out that at this time, I would argue the African-American communities also aren't getting a super fair shake from the media. There was one article when, in 1968, when Wallace and his supporters are at the Milwaukee Auditorium and Father Grappi and the Black Commandos and the youth council are there. And the article starts in a really strange way. It says like both crazy fringe groups get out and shout at each other and it's craziness or something, right? So although Wallace is maybe not getting a super neutral view, in many ways, I think they explained what he said in a relatively neutral way. It's fair to say that he did benefit from media attention, and the media was certainly not favorable towards his opponents, to be sure, at least the civil rights groups either. Okay. My favorite part of doing the research, and I think the thing that I found most interesting was going through microfilm, which was a blast from the past, I guess, pretty cool. Most newspapers in the state have been digitized, but a lot of the African-American press in Milwaukee had not been. None of it had been. So it was cool. I got to go to the Milwaukee Public Library down the central library there and go through tons of old microfilm. There were really two Black papers that I relied on. And one was called the Milwaukee Star, which was around the entirety of his 4 campaigns. And the other, the Milwaukee Courier, started up for his last 3. And they were amazing. They were really cool to go through. Just from a nerdy history point of view, these papers were really detailed and really interesting and kind of fun, just like previews and visuals into like what people were doing, how they, what life was like in Milwaukee in the Black community during this time period, what issues mattered to them, like also like just arts and entertainment, and they were like their own sections. These were like well put together and well assembled papers that really gave a really close view of life in Milwaukee in the Black community during these campaigns. And Wallace, no surprise, shows up quite a bit in these campaigns. There's all kinds of really unique cartoons that are shown in my book. I threw a few on this slideshow here. One of them here on the right actually is Mayor Meyer, who Summerfest ground is named after. And this cartoon's kind of interesting. It's comparing Wallace to the mayor, who they believe he has this very go slow approach to civil rights. So he's a Democrat of a different cloth, but a similar obstacle, okay? Other images obviously just show Wallace here as kind of a venomous octopus monster, which is kind of cool. Here he is sneaking out the back door to avoid protesters in the middle of it. And this image I thought was really powerful. It shows police officers here passing out badges or pins for Wallace, and in the middle is an African-American police officer not looking very eager to put on that button for reasons I think that are obvious. So these cartoons were just among the many awesome things I found in these Black presses. They had lots of really good articles where they interviewed people on the ground. They had voter banks where they tried to activate people of color in their communities. They really worked hard to try to get out the vote and defeat Wallace and endorse candidates and try to get candidates of color elected. So these newspapers were a real treasure trove and really I don't think have been super well explored in our state. So to go through them and take a look at what was just life like for people in this time period, but also how did people of color react to, respond to, activate against Wallace. That was, I think, my favorite research that I did. That's, I think, the 3rd chapter of my book, and it was my favorite one. There's tons of really great images and passages in there from the Black community. So, the book, the book itself is a history book, so I do not really make many connections to today in the book. People I have talked to since then have asked me to, and I tend to dwell more on the past than in the present, the future. At least that's where I feel like I'm stronger. But obviously, many people have made connections to today in a lot of different parts of the book, which is kind of cool to see. And as I was doing the research, many of these things, kind of were like a punch to the gut, right? Like this idea of like protesting the national anthem and African-American protesters not wanting to stand because they didn't believe that liberty and justice was for all, right? That has connections to today, right? Many people could make connections with the Black Lives Matter movement to many of the goals and objectives to achieve social justice that the commandos and the youth council might have made. There are folks that I've read articles in major newspapers that have compared George Wallace to Trump, in that he is this kind of populist outsider who tells it like it is and blasts the media and uses different devices as sort of cudgels against communities and divides them up, right? So that's again, articles I've read, but it's ultimately really interesting to see, like in the 1960s, some of the things that we debate and discuss and some of the dividing lines that we see in our states we're already there, and we're maybe just starting to form, right? I think people, nowadays, I'd be interested to see how a candidate like George Wallace would do on social media. I think he'd probably be banned on Twitter, is pretty safe guess. But how would, in a world today where we interact digitally, in this time period, people came out in the public square and had these very vocal clashes, mostly nonviolent. There were a couple times there where the skirmishes got a little hot between both sides, but relatively nonviolent protests, despite very vocal and strong and passionate both support and opposition to Governor Wallace. So his campaigns in Wisconsin were really just very interesting to me as a person living in the world today, because history never repeats itself, but there's an old cliche that it rhymes, and I think there are lots of parts of our state's history that do rhyme a little bit with where we are at today. So all right, I think that covered everything that I had prepared. I'm open to any questions that any of you all have about anything related to the book.
Thank you so much. You stole my line. I was also going to say that it rhymed, because that's something I first, before the book came out, you had written an article for the State Historic Preservation Office, their Wisconsin History Magazine, and I'd read it, and that was definitely, I was like, oh, look at all these great not great, but clearly identifiable parallels to the things that we're seeing today, and definitely, I think, important when we talk about racism and segregation, and that it's not, the North is one thing and the South is another. There's a lot of gray area and complication, and people who thought racist things who lived here too, which, is something people always think about and talk about and all of that. So, and then now having read your book and getting all the great images and, even more information, it's really fascinating. So if you guys have questions, you can put them in the Q&A or the chat. I was going to ask you about parallels to now, so you're stealing all my question thunder, but I guess while we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions, I know you said that the newspaper research for the various Black publications was your favorite part, but is there something maybe that didn't fit in the book that could kind of take you off in a different direction, but you didn't explore, or something you wish you had? Maybe it's like a whole other book in and of itself.
Yeah, I think that having written it, and having talked to people that then I've been fortunate, I've read it, I've met people since then. I'm like, oh, I wish I would have met you before this, right? I met a family member of someone who actually worked really hard to organize Wallace's first campaigns in Wisconsin. And his family was really socially conservative. He told me they supported civil rights, but that they supported what was called the Liberty Amendment, which at the time was to abolish the income tax. So that was their entry point into Wallace's campaigns. And again, like it's really difficult, right? Writing a book like this, there are very few times, although there were some in newspapers and in public statements, where people just come out and say, hey, I'm supporting this guy because I don't think that people should be equal, right? That did happen in newspapers, shockingly. When I read those things, I would be like, wow, that's intense. But most people would say, hey, he just tells it like it is, or I believe that states should make these decisions. And again, like without knowing the hearts and minds of people, it's really difficult to know with certainty, like what their motivations are. But, so that was interesting to read what, the people that opposed him had pretty clear-cut reasons and were like, well, I don't want these policies. I want to be living in a society where people are equal, and I opposed his views. But hearing the reasons why these publicly claim to support Wallace, it was kind of eclectic. Like some were like, I don't think people should be equal. And you're like, well, I don't know where you're going with that. But some people had other reasons, like, I think the taxes should be lower. I think that states should make these decisions. I worry about union seniority. And if unions are forced to hire people on an equal basis, I might lose my seniority at my work, right? So it was interesting to kind of dig through the newspapers and see the reasons why people opposed Wallace. I don't know if that helps answer the question or not.
Yeah,
but that was interesting to see too.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And then Mary wants to confirm that Bremer actually worked on Wallace's campaigns, or was he following him more covertly?
Yeah, he wasn't like a high up, and I think he volunteered in his Wisconsin campaign. And then when Wallace was here, he kind of stalked him out. Then he actually went up to Canada while Nixon was up there and tried to assassinate Nixon, which he's like, that's too hard. So then he's like, I guess I'm going back to this guy. And then he followed him to Michigan, couldn't get it done. And then he went to Maryland and was able to successfully attempt his assassination, unsuccessfly. I mean, he shot him, but did not kill him. So yes, he was not like a higher up on there, but he did have access to Wallace while he was campaigning in Wisconsin. That is correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Megan's question is a little bit long, but excellent. So I'm wondering where Wallace fits into the shift of the parties from the Democratic Party being Southern and conservative to being the Liberal Party, essentially, that we know it is today. At what point was it odd for Wallace to be running as a Democrat, or was it ever out of place in his various campaigns? Did he still represent an existing wing of the Democratic Party by 1976?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So remember, like in the 60s, there were Democrats that supported civil rights, and there were Southern Democrats who did not. There were liberal Republicans who supported civil rights, and there were conservative Republicans who did not. So it wasn't the party lines were not as clearly divided as maybe we would say today, right? But Wallace comes at a time where I think the parties are starting to change. When LBJ signs the Civil Rights Act in 1964, I think he famously says, I have just flushed the Democratic vote down the toilet for a generation or something. And I think it will probably be longer than that. But ultimately, the parties are starting to shift. Wallace is an outlier. He does not get, the party establishment is not behind him at any point in any of his 4 campaigns. Sometimes they just kind of wait till he loses, and then he's still invited to talk at their the DNC, the convention and stuff, but he's always kind of this odd duck. Even as early as 64, he doesn't fit in with where the Democratic Party is really headed. What's interesting about the times that Wallace does the best is Wisconsin is an open primary state. So in theory, conservatives could make a call and be like, okay, I could vote in this primary, or I could vote in this primary. And the times that Wallace does the best are 64 and 72. And in both of those campaigns, Wallace does not face any opposition, or there's no Republican primary. Essentially, both have been decided. Nixon is the one in 1972, and it's already been settled in 64 as well. So in theory, conservative Republicans could cross over to vote for Wallace. Now, are they doing that to blow up the primary and be like, ooh, look at these Democrats voting for this fringe guy, right? In our states, you can do that. You can vote in the other side's primary if you're in one party, and you could do that with a devious intention. Or they could just, maybe they like him. Maybe they like the way he's speaking, right? And there are some ads, interestingly, in 76, there are ads out there that say, vote for Wallace or Reagan, which is interesting because it's like, pick a conservative, right? So that's kind of unusual. But the parties, I think by the time we hit the end of Wallace's time, the idea of finding anyone else like him in the future would be impossible to imagine, right? By the time we hit the 80s, the Republicans have really adopted a much more conservative platform, and Democrats have become the more liberal party. And over time, we've seen those ideas of even moderates, but conservative, Southern Democrats kind of gone, and liberal Northern Republicans harder to find as well. So the parties have definitely shifted. And I think Wallace was part of a dying breed of Southern Democrats that were still conservative and opposed civil rights. But it's hard to imagine today Wallace running in the party's primary. It was possible back then just because of the way it was made up. But again, Wisconsin's open primary system meant you didn't have to be a Democrat to vote for him. You could be a conservative or an independent, a Republican. Anyone could vote for him to either be mischievous or because they liked him. So it's hard to know with any certainty, like of that percentage of the vote he got about a quarter to a third in the 2 elections he did the best. It's not super clear. Like, did he get that because he had genuine support? Were people voting in protest of other issues? Were they voting to embarrass Democrats and try to make it look like the guys that they want are not going to win? I don't know. It's not super clear. But to Megan's question, like Wallace is kind of the last, I would say the last by 76. Someone like him running in a primary and having any support would have been pretty shocking in the 80s or beyond, I think. Good question.
Well, yeah, and he's and I don't know that just from like reading what you've written, I kind of get the sense that with his sort of rise happens with this kind of uncertainty sort of swirling around him, and so he's sort of perfectly poised to be sort of around for long enough and like say the crazy things, and he sort of came of age at the right time, at least for the party, as the parties kind of broke down.
And he's just a really non-traditional candidate that just like goes out there and just kind of wings it and gives this like, I mean, there are people that compare his events to like, you know, circus acts or like a revival show, or there's a quote in there by a famous author that says that he felt like Wallace was gravitating above them because he's just such a fiery and intense speaker, right? So he could do things that I think transcended party in a way as well. He could just really get folks out there that weren't really even cued in, like union folks that were voting against what their labor union leaders would say because they admired that Wallace like said it how it was and that he spoke truth to power and he wasn't part of the establishments, right? I think again, things like that can echo over time, but Wallace had a very populist approach that appealed to a lot of people that felt during a time of Vietnam War, during a time of social change, he really tapped into feelings of resentment very effectively, for sure.
Awesome. Any other questions? Well, I will take the opportunity to say that HMI has copies of Ben's book for sale on our website and in our store. I highly recommend it. The cartoons, which we saw some of, but the images are really interesting to look at up close and dissect a little bit more on your own. Yeah, and thank you to Ben. And thank you to everybody who has joined us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Of course. Excellent. Okay, well, I see no more questions. So thank you all. I said this at the beginning, but we are recording. I'm going to try and put the recording up tomorrow, and then I'll let everybody know who signed up that it's available, but it's on our YouTube channel. So yeah, excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us and have a good night. Bye.